Okay, where did you see blood at?
On the pillows and the cups and on the bed. And then I started crying, but I tried to call 911. Ran here.
You ran?
As fast as I could.
In every small town, there are stories that never make the headlines, stories that blend seamlessly into the fabric of daily life. Bradford, Ohio, was one of those towns. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where the rhythms of life flowed slowly and peacefully, and where tragedy seemed as distant as the distant horizon. In this quiet, close-knit community lived 4-year-old Dameon Huffman, a boy who had never known a life filled with anything other than love, laughter, and the comforting presence of his grandparents. To those who knew him, Dameon was a vibrant child, full of energy and curiosity, his wide eyes taking in the world around him with a sense of wonder. But all of that changed on March 27, 2003, when Dameon's life, and the lives of everyone who knew him, was torn apart in a single heart-stopping moment. The day started like any other. The sun rose over the sprawling fields of the Myers family farm, and Dameon awoke to the familiar sights and sounds of home.
I turned 4 because I had my birthday already.
What do you remember?
The door opened.
Your bedroom door?
Yeah.
And who did you see?
He lived on this 40-acre property with his great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers, and his mother, Amber. His grandparents had raised him since birth, offering him a life full of love and warmth in a world where he always felt safe. They were his everything. To them, he was the greatest gift they'd ever received, and they gave him everything they had: his life, their love, their time, and their energy. Jack and Linda, now in their 50s, had come together later in life, blending their families through marriage. Jack had spent many years running a small pizza shop in town, a place that was cherished by the community for its warm atmosphere and delicious food. Together, Jack and Linda had become the foundation of their family, offering not just support to their daughter Amber, but also helping raise Dameon with a love that went beyond that of grandparents. It was the kind of love that transforms a child into the very center of your world. For Dameon, life was simple. It was full of fun-filled days spent with Grandpa Jack, who would often scoop him up and take him on drives around the farm. They had an inseparable bond, a bond that made their lives richer and more meaningful. Dameon was the joy of their lives. Whether it was sharing meals at the table or laughter echoing through the house during family gatherings, every moment spent together was treasured. This was a family that knew the value of togetherness, the kind of family where the love of grandparents for their grandchild was felt in every room, every smile, every hug. But life, as we know, can change in an instant. And so it did. March 27, 2003, started like any other day on the farm. Little did anyone know, the calm and quiet that defined the farm was about to be shattered forever. Dameon woke up that morning, as he always did, ready to start his day. He expected to be greeted by the familiar, comforting voices of his grandparents. But this morning, something was different. Something was wrong. Dameon, in his innocent confusion, couldn't understand why there was no sign of his grandparents. He hurriedly made his way downstairs, worried that he might be late for preschool. But what he found was not the warm, loving sight of his grandparents ready to greet him. Instead, what he saw was the stuff of nightmares, his grandparents lying lifeless in their bed, victims of a brutal act that no child should ever have to witness. It's impossible to put into words what it must have been like for Dameon. At just 4 years old, he was faced with a scene that no adult could ever prepare themselves for, let alone a young child. In his confusion and terror, Dameon tried to make sense of what had happened. He didn't know the word for murder. He didn't understand death the way an adult would. His only way to process it was to say that his grandparents were melting. In his young mind, it was the only explanation he could come up with. The horror he must have felt in that moment is unimaginable. But even in his confusion, Dameon did what no child his age should ever have to do. He tried to help. He grabbed a tissue and tried to tend to his grandfather's injuries, though it was clear there was nothing he could do. It was too late. The violence that had taken his grandparents' lives had come so suddenly, so brutally, that there was no way for anyone to undo the damage. Desperate and scared, Dameon knew he couldn't stay there. He had to leave. He had to find help. Despite his young age, his instincts told him to run, to get away from the horror that had just entered his world. He ran for over a mile, through the cold, dark morning, to the daycare where he thought he could find safety. Covered in blood, in his pajamas, Dameon ran with a resolve that only the most desperate could muster, hoping someone, anyone, could help him. When he arrived at the daycare, The staff were horrified at the sight of him. They immediately recognized him as one of their students, but they were shaken to the core by the sight of a 4-year-old boy alone, covered in blood and clearly traumatized. In their panic, they called 911, and the police were immediately dispatched to the Myers farm. No one knew exactly what they would find when they arrived, but it was clear something awful had happened. At the farm, the first responders were greeted by an eerie silence. The front door was wide open, and the officers, guns drawn, entered the house cautiously. What they found inside would haunt them forever: the lifeless bodies of Jack and Linda, both victims of brutal gunshot wounds. Their deaths weren't accidental. They had been executed in cold blood. Back at the daycare, Dameon remained in the care of the police as the investigation began to unfold. His safety was now the top priority. For the officers, the task ahead seemed almost insurmountable. Who could have committed such a horrific crime in a small, peaceful town like Bradford? No one could answer that question yet, and there were more questions than answers as they began to piece together the events of the morning. As the investigation deepened, everyone, including Dameon's mother Amber, was forced to grapple with the unimaginable: the brutal murder of 2 beloved family members, and the knowledge that their only witness was a 4-year-old child. But Dameon had witnessed something that could change the course of the investigation. His memory was the key to solving the case, but it also meant that his life might now be in danger. The horrifying discovery at the Myers farmhouse sent shockwaves through the small community of Bradford, Ohio. The once peaceful town now found itself at the center of a mystery so dark and unsettling that it left even the most seasoned investigators questioning what could have led to such a brutal double homicide. For the police, every lead felt like it was just out of reach. No witnesses, no obvious motive, just 2 bodies lying lifeless in their home. The farm, once a symbol of family and peace, now stood as the backdrop to a tragedy that no one could understand. With Dameon the only living witness, the investigation was a race against time. The young boy had been found covered in blood, his tiny frame trembling with fear. But he wasn't talking. Whether it was from trauma or confusion, Dameon's silence was a complication the police weren't prepared for. He hadn't spoken a word about what had happened, only uttering his strange interpretation of the event. His grandparents were melting. At just 4 years old, Dameon couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what he had witnessed, but the detectives knew that somewhere in his mind was a crucial piece of the puzzle that could help them solve the crime. Back at the farmhouse, detectives began combing through the scene, looking for anything that might provide insight into what had taken place. The most perplexing detail was that nothing appeared to have been stolen. The house had been left undisturbed. Money, electronics, purses, and personal items were all still in place. The theory that this was a botched robbery quickly fell apart. If this was a robbery, why were all these valuables left untouched? It didn't make sense. Whoever had killed Jack and Linda Myers had come for something else, something more personal. As the investigation progressed, the focus shifted toward those closest to the victims. Initially, the police had no suspects. This wasn't the kind of crime that fit the typical profile. Small-town murders were rare, and a double homicide like this, with no clear motive, was even rarer. With no break in the case, the investigators began looking into the Myers' close circle: family, friends, anyone who might have had a reason to hurt them. The first name that came up was Greg Myers, Jack's son from his first marriage. He was a 25-year-old man who had grown up on the farm and had always been close to his father. Just months before the murders, Greg had served as the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding, and to anyone who knew him, he appeared to be a model son, polite, respectful, and well-liked by the community. He didn't have a criminal record, and there were no apparent issues between him and his father or stepmother. Yet, there was something about Greg that made John, a longtime family friend and neighbor, uneasy. John, who had known the Myers family for years, became suspicious of Greg. He shared his concerns with the police, suggesting that they look into him more closely. It seemed out of place for someone like Greg to be involved in such a gruesome crime, but with no other leads, the detectives had no choice but to investigate. Greg was brought in for questioning, and his response to the situation was unsettling. When he walked into the interview room, he appeared visibly upset, his demeanor erratic. He immediately asked for a trash can, claiming his stomach had been upset all day. As he sat down to speak with the detectives, he spoke about his father and stepmother in a way that seemed genuine. He was cooperative, answering questions and even offering to take a lie detector test. His answers were clear, and his alibi was solid. He had been at work that morning, 30 miles away from the crime scene, and had a time-stamped paycheck to prove it. Despite the fact that his alibi seemed to check out, something about Greg's behavior made the detectives uncomfortable. His emotional outbursts didn't seem entirely genuine, and the way he volunteered information seemed rehearsed. Greg even went so far as to allow the police to search his home, but at this point, there was no direct evidence linking him to the murders. The detectives, though, had begun to wonder if they were missing something. It seemed like the case was going cold, but they weren't ready to give up. They turned their attention back to Dameon, the only person who could provide them with the most important piece of the puzzle. Dameon, despite being so young, had experienced something no child should ever have to go through. His mind, understandably, was still processing the trauma of witnessing the deaths of his beloved grandparents. The detectives knew that if Dameon was able to recall more details about that fateful morning, it could be the breakthrough they needed. But how could they get a 4-year-old to remember what had happened? How could they unlock the memory of such a traumatic event? The answer came in a form they hadn't considered: a dollhouse. In a small, quiet room away from the chaos of the investigation, the detectives set up a small-scale model of the Myers home. They used dolls to represent Dameon, his grandparents, and the mysterious figure that had appeared in their home that morning. The hope was that by acting out the scene in a way that felt familiar and non-threatening, Dameon might open up about what he had seen. As Dameon played with the dolls, he began to act out the movements he had made that morning, and slowly, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. He described how, before he went downstairs to check on his grandparents, he had heard a noise. Someone had entered his room. But it wasn't his grandmother or grandfather. In fact, it wasn't anyone he knew. It was a man, a stranger, dressed in a dark green jumpsuit, holding a shotgun. The realization was chilling. Dameon had come face to face with the person who had just murdered his grandparents. At this point, the investigation took a significant turn. The description of the man wearing a green jumpsuit immediately stood out. It was vague enough to leave room for interpretation, but specific enough to give the detectives a lead. They knew that if they could connect this stranger to the crime, they might be able to find their killer. But where to begin? Then, a breakthrough came. Just 5 miles away from the Myers farm, in the Stillwater River, police recovered a 12-gauge shotgun, the weapon used to kill Jack and Linda. The shotgun's serial number had been sanded off to prevent identification, but after forensic analysis, they were able to restore the number. It wasn't long before they found a local newspaper ad listing a similar shotgun for sale. The ad had been posted just 2 days before the murders, on March 25th. The timeline was crucial, and detectives knew they had to act fast. They traced the ad to the seller, who led them to a name that would change everything: Greg Myers. The discovery of Greg Myers' name in connection with the shotgun brought the investigation to a startling new level. Up until that point, Greg had seemed like the most unlikely suspect. He was Jack Myers' son, a man with no criminal history, well-liked by the community, and seemingly devoted to his family. But the more the detectives looked into him, the clearer it became that the investigation needed to focus on him. After the shotgun's serial number had been restored, detectives traced it back to the person who had sold it, a man who was then able to link it to a local listing in the newspaper. Through this, they uncovered that the shotgun had been sold to none other than Greg Myers. The same shotgun used in the murders of Jack and Linda Myers was in Greg's possession just days before the killings. This was the lead they had been waiting for. The detectives, now more certain than ever that Greg was involved, began to dig deeper into his background. They discovered something alarming. Greg had been facing financial ruin. His house had been foreclosed on, and he had fallen behind on payments. He was struggling to make ends meet, and this was a man with a family of his own to care for. While this alone might not have been enough to establish a clear motive, the detectives soon learned that Greg stood to inherit his parents' property and farm if they died. This information added a disturbing new layer to the investigation. It was clear now, Greg had a reason to kill his parents. The detectives' next step was to bring him in for questioning again, this time with a more focused approach. They pressed him on his financial troubles and asked him directly about the inheritance. Greg, however, remained calm, his demeanor almost too controlled, as if he had been preparing for this moment. He denied any involvement in the murders, but the detectives could see that the pressure was starting to mount. Still, there was no hard evidence that directly tied Greg to the crime, just circumstantial evidence and the disturbing motive of financial desperation. But just when it seemed that the investigation had hit a wall, something unexpected happened. A crucial piece of evidence was found, something that would bring the entire case into sharp focus. During a second search of the Stillwater River, where the shotgun had been discovered, a suspicious trash bag was found floating in the water. The bag, tied shut, contained items that would prove devastating to Greg: a green jumpsuit matching the description Dameon had given, latex gloves with a fingerprint that was later matched to Greg, 12-gauge shotgun slugs identical to those used in the murders, and, most damning of all, a pair of tennis shoes, 2 sizes smaller than Greg's own feet but identical to the footprints found at the crime scene, near the window where the killer had entered the house. The evidence was undeniable. Greg had been there. He had worn the jumpsuit. He had been the one to murder his father and stepmother. When the police confronted Greg with the new evidence, he was arrested. The shocking truth was out. For those close to the Myers family, it was a devastating blow. Greg had been seen as the very person who could be trusted, the one who had been closest to his father. To know that he had killed the 2 people who had raised him and loved him was unfathomable. For his family, the arrest felt like a terrible betrayal. For Dameon, the nightmare was finally coming to an end. He had witnessed the brutal murder of his grandparents, and now, after months of investigation, the person responsible was finally behind bars. But the emotional toll on the young boy was far from over. His grandparents, the people who had raised him with so much love and care, were gone. He would never get to hear their voices again or feel the warmth of their embrace. Greg's trial began in April of 2004, and the courtroom was filled with family and friends who had once gathered together to celebrate life. Now, they sat in disbelief, watching as the man they thought they knew stood trial for the brutal murders of his father and stepmother. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Greg Myers pleaded not guilty. His defense team tried to argue that the case was circumstantial, but the evidence was clear, and the jury was quick to deliberate. On April 27, 2004, after just a few hours of deliberation, the jury found Greg Myers guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder. The room was silent as the verdict was read. Greg, once a beloved member of the community, now stood condemned for the murders of his father Jack and his stepmother Linda. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. It was a moment of cold justice, but for many, it felt like nothing could bring back the lives that had been lost. The emotional toll on the Myers family was immeasurable. Amber, Dameon's mother, had to come to terms with the fact that the man she had once trusted, the man who had been her brother-in-law, was capable of such horrific violence. The entire community struggled to make sense of what had happened. How could a son kill his own parents for money? How could someone so seemingly good, so close to the family, turn into a murderer? For Dameon, the trial marked the end of a long and painful chapter in his life. But even as the justice system did its part, Dameon was left to heal from the trauma he had experienced. He was placed in the care of his mother, Amber, who, despite her grief over losing her parents, did her best to provide the love and support her son needed to rebuild his life. The Myers family legacy, once defined by love, warmth, and togetherness, now existed only in the memories of those who had known Jack and Linda. Dameon, now 22 years old, carried forward that legacy. He had grown into a hard-working, strong young man, overcoming the trauma of his childhood and becoming the person his grandparents would have been proud of. His story was one of survival, bravery, and resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. Though the darkness of the past would never completely fade, Dameon honored his grandparents with every step he took. The strength and love they had instilled in him continued to guide him, and as he moved forward in life, he carried their memory with him, honoring them through the choices he made and the person he had become. In the end, the legacy of Jack and Linda Myers lived on through the spirit of their grandson, who had endured so much and yet still found a way to rise above it all. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more emotional, true crime stories. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about the case and the incredible strength of Dameon? We'd love to hear your perspective. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more stories that dive deep into the heart of justice, loss, and the courage to move forward.